Hello and welcome to Deep Sky Sanctuary. My name is Eric, and today I wanted to review the ZWO ASI533MM Pro. This is an astronomical imaging camera. It's monochrome and it's cooled. And I've completed over a dozen projects with this camera. So I just wanted to share, its specs, my experience. I wanted to make some comparisons with its bigger brother, the ZWO 2600, which is the same exact camera except just a larger sensor size, which I also have and use a lot. And I just wanted to end with who I think this camera is for and maybe who it's not for. But long story short, I'm really thrilled with the performance of this camera. I think it's great. I think it's a great way to transition into monochrome imaging if you're currently shooting one-shot color. And especially, it's an easy move up from something like an Astro modified DSLR or mirrorless. The performance jump is going to be crazy because you have the performance from monochrome and just the sensitivity of these new cooled cameras. From the latest generation, you get the latest CMOS sensor technology. I think you will be thrilled. But don't take my word for it. Before we get more into the details, I wanted to share some images I've captured with this camera to hopefully get you as excited as I am about it. So here's a few. Okay, so I hope you're as excited as I am about this camera now. And like I said before, if you've been paying attention at all, you've probably heard of the ZWO 2600mm. It's really probably the most popular astronomical imaging camera, either the 2600mm or its one-shot color counterpart, the 2600MC. And this camera, the 533mm, is the same exact camera, except the sensor size is 1 inch, whereas the 2600mm is an APS-C size. I would show you a comparison with the 1 inch on the 533 with the 2600mm, but I didn't want to disturb my setup. It's attached to the Esprit 120 outside right now. But yeah, so it's just a smaller sensor size, and it captures, the 533 captures in 14-bit instead of 16-bit. But in terms of your final image, it's not going to change really the dynamic range or anything like that. So essentially, it's just the sensor size that you're paying the difference in. And the price difference is the 533mm is less than half the price of the 2600mm. And that doesn't even take into account the filters, because this guy takes really small filters. You can get away with 1.25 inch. If you plan on upgrading later, you might want to get 36 millimeter, but you can get away with 1.25 inch. And these are really small and they're way cheaper. Both the filter wheel, this is an 8-position filter wheel, is way cheaper than anything 36 millimeter or 2 inch. And then the filters themselves are a lot cheaper too. But yeah, all that to say, when I go into the properties of this camera, they're the same for the 2600, and they're the reason why these cameras are so popular right now. So let's get into some of those awesome properties that these cameras share. Okay, so one of the super great properties of this series of cameras is the really low read noise. So whenever you have a CMOS sensor like this, you have the incident photons hitting it, and those get converted to some electrical signal, and then the voltage essentially gets converted into a digital signal. And it's at this point that you get read noise. And I'll show you a chart. It's measured in electrons, and you'll see from this chart given by ZWO just how interesting the read noise is on this camera. So it starts off pretty low, but you could see once it gets to the gain 100, it completely plummets. And then above, there's a chart that I'm going to put up of the dynamic range. And you'll see that at gain 100, you essentially have the same dynamic range as gain 0. So the read noise is really low. That means you're going to be able to just pick up more of those faint details because it's going to be fighting. It's not going to be fighting against that noise that you're going to have fighting against those details. And yeah, and as you could probably tell from this chart, you really want to be either shooting gain 0 or gain 100. I say if you can get away with gain 100, shoot that because you're not really sacrificing dynamic range. But sometimes if you're taking, you know, LRGB data and you're finding that to not be overexposed, you have to take like, 20 or 30-second subs. Those could really add up in the pre-processing stage and just storage on your computer. So in those cases, you might want to do gain 0. But for me personally, yeah, I'm always at gain 0 or gain 100 for this chart right here, just for the purposes of this chart. So really no low read noise, which is awesome. Okay, so the next property that I want to talk about is the quantum efficiency of this camera. And all quantum efficiency really means is if I have light going into this sensor, it's the probability that that light is actually going to be converted to real signal. So it's always measured in a curve. So you'll see this chart again provided by ZWO, and it's a measure of the quantum efficiency. So it's a percentage versus the wavelength. And you'll see that it peaks at 91%, which is very good. Every generation of CMOS sensors we go, that gets higher and higher. And what this means practically is that compared to a sensor with a lower quantum efficiency, like for example, my EOS R here, this is a mirrorless camera. This peaks at, I think, around 80%. What that means is that for the same amount of exposure time that you're going to get, you're going to be getting more signal with this camera, a sensor with higher quantum efficiency. So that means less exposure time for the same image. It's just a complete win. So fantastic performance here as well. Okay, and the next couple are some of my favorite properties of this camera, these series of cameras, and that's that there is 0 amp glow. So for those of you that have been fortunate and never experienced a camera that has a lot of amp glow, basically amp glow is parts of your sensor during a long exposure. Well, the longer the exposure, the more it comes out. Your sensor will generate some infrared light, basically. So even if you have nothing that you want hitting this, if this was completely closed, you'll see a pattern emerge on your camera. And the pattern gets greater as the exposure time is longer. So something, 2-minute will look a little bit better than something 10-minute. And by the time you get to 10-minute, there will be a very clear pattern. But with this latest generation of sensors, there is no amp glow, whether you're doing 5 seconds or 10 minutes. And this really makes calibration so much better. It's so good, in fact, that some people don't even take dark frames anymore because you have low amp glow and then also low dark current, which is really the noise you get from thermal noise. So once you cool this camera down to say -10, I think it could go down to -20. But here in Texas, trying to cool to -20 is kind of futile, and really the benefit is so marginal once you get down there anyway. So I just do -10 year round, and yeah, you get extremely low dark current, extremely low amp glow, and people sometimes will just do away completely with darks because this camera is so good in these two areas. And it really does make calibrating a lot easier. And imaging sessions that you might have to throw out because you couldn't like get your darks or your flats right. This camera just makes it so easy. So really one of my favorite things about this camera. And I'll put up an image here of what amp glow looks like in other cameras, and then I'll put up like an example of what a dark frame looks like for me at 10 minutes, and it's basically nothing. So really, really cool property of this camera. Okay, so now that we've talked about some of the awesome properties that this camera and those properties that it shares with the 2600 and its even bigger brother, the 6200mm, which is a full frame camera, I wanted to talk about that sensor size. As you can see, this is a small sensor, and it is square. You can see that it's square there, right? And if I had my 2600mm to compare with, you would see just how much smaller it really is. And the question is the larger sensor better? And the answer is probably yes, with some caveats. And I want to get into my real world experience of dealing with larger sensor sizes. So a lot of those images that you saw initially, I took with my Sharpstar 61 EDPH2. This is a very affordable 61mm aperture triplet, and it performs great with the 533mm. I get stars that are perfect corner to corner. I use a 0.8 times reducer on this. That's what this guy is right here, and it works phenomenally. But when I try to use anything larger than this, things deteriorate really quickly, actually. I'm not able to correct for an APS-C sensor. No matter how much I try adjusting the back focus or adjusting tilt, I'm never satisfied with the image that I get in those corners. And another example of this is I have an Esprit 120. Like I said, my 2600 is attached to it right now. And when I originally bought that telescope, I bought a 0.77x reducer. So the telescope is native f7, and this is going to be a 0.77 reducer. So faster imaging speed, things like that. Initially, I tested that reducer with the 533mm, and it performed great. Like there were great stars corner to corner, and I had, no field rotation or anything like that, and I was really happy. And then I attached a 2600mm, and I realized there was a ton of field curvature. So I spent about 2 months. That wasn't like continuous, but with every clear night I had in those months, and I would play with these tiny spacers. Let me see if I can get one out. These teeny spacers, like 0.4 millimeter, 0.2 millimeter spacers, because I was convinced it was a back focus issue. And then I had to make sure my tilt was good, so I had to buy this pretty expensive camera tilting unit. This thing's awesome, by the way. It's a Gerd Neumann, I think is what his name is, CTU, but it's expensive. And what I realized at the end of those couple of months is that my focal reducer / flattener was a complete dud. It was supposed to be 55 millimeter back focus, but I went from 55 to like 62, and they all look the same. So thankfully I was able to get a refund for that, but it looked just fine with this. And if I was using this camera, I would have been able to keep that reducer. I mean, it would have sucked kind of because it's still not a good reducer. I got a lemon. But now I shoot at the native f7 because I had to return that focal reducer. So those are real examples of where the sensor size is a real life thing. And the reality is, even though a lot of telescopes will say crazy things like they're corrected for a full frame or even APS-C, most of them are not. And that's really what you're paying for when you pay for top dollar refractors. You're paying for really good APS-C or full frame performance. And surprisingly, a lot of telescopes don't really perform that good at APS-C. And that's just the reality. And for me, I am definitely in the pixel peeper category. I almost said that weird. Pixel peeper category, where I inspect those corners of my images. I don't let anything slide, and I lose sleep over it. Probably for the worse. But for me, I need perfect stars across my frame, otherwise it'll drive me mad. So not having to deal with the back focus and tilt issues, along with just maybe telescopes not performing up to the standard of an APS-C, that's worth it to me, because I would rather have a smaller image with perfect stars than a larger image where only the center of it looks very good, because the price difference that you're paying for is getting lost in the ugly stars, and I feel like those ugly stars really detract from your overall image. But again, that's my opinion. Most people aren't like me in that respect, but that is my opinion. So again, with the sensor size, there's a couple of things that you could do to sort of compensate for it. The first is you can do mosaics. So, nowadays with the software that we have, it's really easy to do mosaics. And you could stitch together a really nice, 4-panel, 3-panel, however many panels you want image that'll be very high resolution. Another thing that you could do, so for example, with this telescope here, the 61 EDPH2, it's such a small focal length and aperture that most things easily fit in the field of view. So I wasn't really losing anything by having a smaller sensor. So something you can do though, if you're undersampled, which I was in this setup, is that you could do a drizzle integration. And what that does, it's an algorithm that was actually invented for the Hubble Space Telescope, but it doubles the resolution of your image. So you dither your frames. Dithering is just moving your telescope a little bit between each image, and you do a drizzle integration, and you have a doubled resolution. And pretty much all the images you saw earlier were using a drizzle integration, and I think it works great with this this camera. Another thing that's cool with the smaller size is that the vignetting is very minimal. You basically get none, and you could really honestly get away with not taking flat frames. Again, I would never do that. I always take flat frames, but you have pretty much no vignetting with this camera, and I just thought of that. That wasn't the order I meant to do things. But yeah, and then with respect to the shape, which is the square, right? What does that affect? Well, I think it's really nice. I think since you have that limited sensor size, I'm very grateful that they made it a square instead of trying to make it like this tiny rectangle. And I think it frames things nicely, especially smaller things like galaxies or small globular clusters. It frames images really nicely with the square. So I think that's an overall pro. Plus, you don't have to worry about camera rotation, because things will always be like kind of in the right orientation. So you never have to make an extra trip outside because you realize your rotation's off. So those are some of the considerations with the sensor size, how much that's worth to you to have the larger sensor. And again, it is a huge difference, the sensor size. And yeah, how much that's worth to you is up to you. Okay, so the last question is, who is this camera probably for? And Really, I think it's for a lot of people. I really do. I think for people with more affordable telescopes that can't really properly correct a larger camera sensor, despite what they say, um, this is a perfect fit. For somebody that's just trying to dabble into monochrome imaging and don't want to spend a bajillion dollars on filters, this is also a great buy because it's very affordable and it's much less of an investment. It's basically the same price of a new DSLR mirrorless camera for the filters and the camera. And yeah, I would say if you fall into those categories, or if you're a pixel peeper and you just don't want to deal with fiddling with things in the dark, dealing with backspacing and tilt, or like I said, yeah, just less than fantastic optics, I would recommend this camera completely. Also, if you know what kind of targets you're going for and you know how much field of view that they're going to take up, if you have something like a 100 millimeter or 80 millimeter refractor and you're really interested in shooting galaxies or globular clusters in particular, having the square sensor size and is great. But then also, those things will take up such a small field of view that you really don't need the larger sensor. And your final image, you would probably crop it anyway with a 2600. So I would say for those people, this camera is for. For people who know that their telescopes are up to the task of easily correcting for an APS-C with minimal effort, I would say those people should probably get something like the 2600 or a larger sensor. But again, we all are limited by cost at some point, and I think if even if you know that you would be better off with the 2600, I think you could do things like mosaics, as I mentioned before, and you could literally reconstruct the same exact image, maybe with slightly better performance. That's of course assuming you have a bunch of clear skies in a row where you could do that. But yeah, so I would say for somebody that has a pretty premium refractor that could easily correct for APS-C, and you're able to do that, or if you just want the larger field of view and you don't really care about how the corners look that much. Because if you have like a big nebula, it does stink if you have to crop, or if it's just cut off by your limited sensor size. Whereas you might want to prioritize capturing the nebula in its entirety and just accepting less than perfect stars in the corners. So I would say, yeah, this camera performs amazingly and I love it. And I think even with its smaller sensor size, it works for a lot of people, and you can create some of the best astronomical images with this camera despite its low price point. So that's all I have to say today. Thank you for listening, and hopefully that informed you a little bit with my experience with this camera and how that could apply to you. And yeah, clear skies.